Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at 1980X for the Nintendo Switch. And just looking at this game, looking at the cover art with the neons and the pixels, it's obviously an 80s themed game. But this little indie title might actually be ready to give you a much different experience than you would think by looking at the cover or even reading some of the description. 1980X actually starts off with a fairly transparent, stereotypical 80s style story that we could get from anything from The Breakfast Club to Ferris Bueller's Day Off. More or less, the 80s were just angst-ridden, and from torn sleeves to clenched fists to flaring nostrils, being a teenager was tough. So throughout the course of 1980X, we're going to discover the story of one particular teenager's plight to really make sense of their life and find their identity in an overly domesticated suburban environment. How the actual gameplay carries out, though, it's pretty darn cool, I gotta say. If you've ever heard of the game Evoland, you might have some experience already with games that fundamentally change their dynamic as you play. 1980X, though, doesn't just upgrade your graphics the deeper you go into the game, it changes the genres the further you get into the story. Starting off in the very beginning of the game, it's a 2D side-scrolling brawler. And then when that gaming segment comes to a close, we move into more of an R-type style space shooter, into a driving sim, into a side-scrolling ninja action style game, and even all the way into a first-person style dungeon crawler. And while during each of these unique gaming sections we might get introduced to a little bit more of the game's narrative, it's between those sections that we get a longer cutscene that lets us know a little bit more about the emotional struggles or the new realizations and conflicts that the main character of the game is dealing with. And more or less, it's through the playing of these games that our main protagonist, Kid, is actually learning to cope with their life. But moving on from the gameplay and how the story is actually pushed to progress further and further, the visuals of the game and the audio are going to be some obvious draws for any fans of classic or retro style games. The pixel art in 1980X is absolutely phenomenal, and while each of the renditions of the arcade style games might actually be held to a much higher standard than they would have back in the 80s arcade consoles, they do a really amazing job characterizing the kind of games that they were. And in all honesty, some of them, like that side-scrolling ninja action adventure game or even the driving simulator, I would gladly have as full standalone titles. The soundtrack, though, like I said, is also just really amazing, and I went and did some research to figure out who put it together because it's one of few indie game soundtracks that I probably actually do want to own. It's emotional and deep, and it just fits the mood and the tone of the game so well. But despite all of this high praise, 1980X actually does have some areas where gamers might really take up a bit of an issue. One of them, and the most obvious, and probably the most take it or leave it, is going to be the button mapping. The buttons in 1980X are not remappable, so don't worry about it. You'll be playing through 5 different styles of games, and while the buttons are mainly consistent, it'll be your duty as the player to figure out how to play each of these new games. And so there might be a learning curve and it might be a little bit frustrating, but honestly that's kind of part of it, and I actually enjoyed that just a little bit. The next one is going to be the game's length. You can probably crush this game in about 90 minutes regardless of your skill level in any of the style of games. I personally am not really that great at shoot 'em ups and bullet hells, I'll be totally honest, and that section took me the longest and I still finished the game in about an hour and 45. But the ultimate critique to call out here is something that every single player is going to notice, and that is the abruptness of the ending. Short games can be short, but they need to leave you with a sense of resolution at the end, and this one is, well, to put it simply, it probably won't. Some players might be left with a sense of, I want more, and some players might be left with a sense of, WTF, the game literally just got started. But in all honesty, that kind of reaction is going to depend more on what type of player you are and what you expect out of the game. So at this point, I'd like to give anyone watching this video right now the chance to either mute it or turn it off or stop, because I'd like to take some time and actually go into a much deeper critical analysis of what the game's actually meant to be. I promise that I'm going to try and avoid any sort of spoilers if you are interested in this, but if you're afraid of learning anything more about the game than you already know, feel free to just click off the video. So pause for dramatic effect, and let's go. 1980X is a game that, maybe it's just my personal opinion, wasn't meant to be more of a showpiece for the different types of arcade games that existed in the 80s. That to me is just not its point at all. So if you go into 1980X expecting a whole bunch of really vivid experiences with all of your classic favorites growing up, you might actually be pretty disappointed. You're going to get really tiny segments, and they're enjoyable, but that's not the point of the game. The point of the game is actually to experience the main character's narrative as they try to grow up and deal with all this social angst, and using games as a coping mechanism, Every single one of the gaming genres and gaming experiences for their main character are meant to be taken for the player as a metaphor. And if you don't know, I do teach rhetorical analysis, so this is kind of in my wheelhouse. We start off the game with a solo 2D side-scrolling brawler where the main character feels themselves alone and desperate to fight just to find the value in their own existence. Everyone and everything is against them, and they are indeed alone. Moving past that, we have the iconic scene where the main character finds the arcade for the first time and stumbles into an entire new world. And accordingly, their first gaming experience is a 2D side-scrolling space shooter. The gaming experience is new and vivid and alien and foreign and still a fight and a flee, but it's also exciting. It's a new world. Past that, we see cutscenes of the character going through this emotional withdrawal where they just want to run, and accordingly, the next gaming experience they have is the driving sim, where their sole objective is to avoid confrontation, avoid colliding with any obstacles, and just go as fast and as far as they can. And through the following cutscenes again, we're confronted with the idea of the character realizing that that's not working, it's not a lifestyle that's actually doing anything. And then we're sent on to the ninja side-scrolling action-adventure title. They're still fleeing, but now they realize that they're being pursued. There's some monster, but they also realize at this point that they do have some ability to fight back. But even though they do manage to avoid that pursuing monster all the way to the end of that particular gaming experience, the last scene is that it consumes them utterly. And this is what inevitably throws us into the dark 2D first-person dungeon crawler. The main character is expected to find their own way through a black, dark world. But this time, for the first time, they're carving their own paths that we can see in the minimap, and it's their duty to confront the demons in their world to actually gain their freedom. And in all honesty, for the first time in the entire game, this is when the main character of the story figures out that they have to be agentive, they have to have agency, and actually do something for themselves. And now, there's no choice, they can't run anymore. Opening up past that, it becomes very obvious. It's way past the point of symbolism and metaphor, and so I've done what I can to not spoil the actual ending of the game. But with those insights, you can figure out everything from yourself pretty easily. But regardless, you're still probably going to feel like the game was too short and ended a little too abruptly. So yeah, me personally, I am hoping that they actually do follow up with a sequel. But anyway, if you hung through my meta-analysis of what it meant to be 1980X and the deeper meanings, I appreciate it. But that does about wrap up the review of 1980X on the Nintendo Switch. So if you enjoyed the review, if you found it helpful, and especially if you enjoyed my little sidebar, my little kind of going in depth on it, feel free to throw me a comment or a like to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. As you can see, there are new and unique indies coming out literally every single day, and whether they're a hard pass or a real diamond in the rough, you're gonna find out about them right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.